We have seen a few ways that components within your applications can communicate with each other. For example, through prototypal inheritance, child components can communicate with the parent components. Note that I'm using the term components here loosely. This obviously applies not only to components, but to directives, controllers, and so on. Another way components can communicate is through shared singleton services. Shared services that are created with the .service method are singletons, and therefore different components can share data between each other using that single instance of the service. However, there are situations where such communications are just not elegant enough and create too many dependencies between different parts of your application. Let's take a look at some illustrations. Take a look at this diagram. Suppose component 2 wanted to communicate some data to its parent component 1. We have a couple of ways of achieving that. First, we can access component 1 from component 2 by simply going up the scope chain and accessing the parent controller. Angular makes this easy for us with the $parent property on the $scope object. This is obviously not the end, since we still have to make sure that either we set up mechanisms in component 1 to react to the new data, or somehow invoke something from component 2. In other words, we still have to make sure that component 1 is aware of our communication. We can also use the ampersand method callback method binding and call the parent's components method, passing it some data. So that's communicating with the parent. In the flipped scenario, we want to communicate with the child component. One quick way of doing this is for component 2 to provide some way for us to send the data into it. Again, component 2 would have to have some way to react to the new data. Things get a bit more interesting if you wanted a component to communicate with its grandparent component. An elegant solution to this is a bit less obvious. Should you use the $parent property twice to crawl up the scope chain to get to your destination? I don't know. Look at the dependency we're creating with that move. Another possibly more elegant solution is to use a singleton service and inject it into both components. You would still need to set up some watch for the value stored in the shared service in component 1 so you can react to any changes in the shared service value. When the target is reversed, we're faced with a similar dilemma. Should we send the data into component 2 and have component 2 send data to component 1? Or should we use our shared service again? Not sure, but doesn't really feel elegant quite so much anymore. And what about communicating with multiple components at once? Here, the components we want to communicate with seem scattered all over the DOM. Component 4, for example, is neither a descendant nor an ancestor of our component 2 where we're sending the messages from. Yes, we could still use our shared singleton service approach, but we'd have to use it everywhere and things are getting a bit messy. A similar scenario is when multiple components want to communicate with one central component, but its location within the DOM is not known to those components. Again, we could use the shared service approach, and again, this would be a messy way to approach reacting to some data change or UI change that we need to respond to. Luckily, there's actually a software design pattern that could solve all these issues in an elegant way, and which Angular implements through its event system. The design pattern is called Publish Subscribe Design Pattern. And basically, there are two components to this design pattern: publishers and subscribers. Publishers send messages to subscribers on some common channel. So when we speak about publishers, publishers mark messages with some classification. Publishers also don't know the subscribers of their messages, nor do they know if there are any subscribers out there at all. Subscribers, on the other hand, sign up to listen for messages with a particular classification. They also don't know publishers or if there are any publishers for these particular messages at all. In Angular, the common channel in which these messages communicate over is scope. Messages that we're speaking about in this design pattern are called events that can hold data. There are two types of publishers in Angular event handling. The first one is called Emit, and Emit goes up the chain scope. So if component 3 wanted to emit an event called greet with the data with message equals hi, that event would keep going up the scope until it reached all the way the top scope in the application. The other way to publish messages in Angular is to broadcast them, and that's done with the $broadcast method. Using that method, events go down the chain scope. So for example, if the very top scope broadcasted an event with the name greet and the data with a message equals hi, that event would propagate all the way down the chain scope to the very last leaf in the scope chain. The way you subscribe to an event in Angular is by calling a special method on the scope service called $on, and you provided the name of the event you're subscribing to and some handler function that deals with what to do once you caught that event. You might be wondering the following question. What happens when the target of your broadcast is not in the direct path of your broadcast call down the chain? Or the other way around, if you're emitting an event, the target is not in the direct scope chain of your event going up the scope chain. The answer is that you can broadcast your event from the parent scope of everything in your app, otherwise known as the root scope. You may not have realized up until now, but the ng app that we have declared on some top element like HTML in our HTML page is actually the parent controller to all controllers, directives, and components that live under it. Angular has a special service called $rootScope that you can inject into anything in your application in order to refer to the highest scope in the chain possible, meaning the root scope. Therefore, if your component 3 is trying to reach component 4, which is not in a direct scope chain up the chain tree, you can use the $rootScope $broadcast inside of your component 3, and what that will do is that will reach the very top of your scope chain and will propagate down, reaching component 4. Note that when you broadcast from the root scope, every single node in your application gets the event and has a chance to respond to it. Okay, let's look at some syntax. The call to emit and broadcast can be done from a controller, service, a component, or anything really. Don't forget the $ as part of the emit method name. As we said, $emit sends an event up the scope chain. $broadcast, on the other hand, sends the event down the scope chain. Note that it's a best practice to namespace the event name string. This is useful for code readability down the line when you try to understand what part of the system the event is targeting. In both cases, you could send an object along with the event containing some data which can be unwrapped when the event arrives at its destination. The last step is to register a listener for your event. This is done with a $on function that's executed on some $scope or $rootScope, which is really just the top scope in the application. Obviously, we need to use the same event name string we broadcasted or emitted the event with. The handler function is automatically passed 2 arguments. The event, which holds the event information, including that event name string, and most importantly, the data object. This data object is what contains the data that we wrap together with the event when it was emitted or broadcasted. Okay, time to get back to the code editor and see these concepts in action.